What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Fireside Giants. I'm your host, Anthony Rovardo, joined by my co-host, Alex Wilson, and the Giants are preparing for tomorrow afternoon's game against the Las Vegas Raiders. This Week 9 matchup, the Giants 2-6, the Raiders 3-5. Who will win? Well, the Giants are going into this healthier than ever, or so we thought. So the Giants are likely to get back Evan Neal, probably also getting back Andrew Thomas, it sounds like, and we know that Daniel Jones is making his first start in several weeks tomorrow against the Raiders. However, there is going to be a key loss from the lineup, and that is tight end Darren Waller. Suffered the hamstring injury early in last week's matchup, left the game, did not return, and now it sounds like he could be headed to the injured reserve, which would of course be a massive loss for the Giants offense. Now, this has been a very bad offense. They have struggled to get the ball in the hands of their playmakers all season long, but one player, in my opinion, in the receiving game who's been very consistently open and making plays with the ball is Darren Waller. And now without Darren Waller in the lineup, the Giants are once again missing that true X-Factor number one primary receiving threat, so they're going to have to go with this ragtag by committee, use all of these different receivers that they have, and try to figure it out, which, again, with such a bad offense, is not going to be easy for them. So we're going to go ahead and dive into this Darren Waller injury, what it means for the team, talk about the reports that we're hearing, which may indicate this is a long-term injury, and everything else in between. But before we dive into all that, make sure to leave a like if you do enjoy this episode, subscribe to the channel if you are new, ring the bell so you don't miss an episode, and comment your thoughts on the topic down below in the comment section. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and go ahead and follow us on all of our social media channels at Fireside Giants. Without further ado, Alex, how are you doing today, my friend, and what is your reaction to the Darren Waller injury update?
I'm doing okay. It kind of feels like, I know a lot of people are probably going to agree with me on this, every time the Giants get close to getting a healthy offense, another guy goes down. And it's like the same old cycle every single year. Like, we're just about to get this guy back, and then like half our offense gets injured. We're about to get Daniel Jones back, about to get Andrew Thomas back, about to get Evan Neal back, and then Darren Waller goes down with a hamstring injury, and he's likely headed to injured reserve, which will keep him out for a minimum of 4 weeks. So, you know, Daniel Jones and Waller struggled to connect early in the season, pass protection really being the catalyst behind that failure to generate much production. His best game, Waller, came against Washington with Tyrod Taylor under center, go figure, 98 yards and a touchdown. That was the game that we said to ourselves, okay, that was the guy we brought in. We know that Waller can do those things. However, another thing that we knew about Waller, he's injury prone. That was never, that was never a secret. Everyone knew he was injury prone. It was just trying to keep him healthy. If he was healthy, he would be a high octane player for this offense. Now, the problem is he's injured again. And about 2 days before he got injured, and now this whole thing is coming out, I asked on Twitter, do people think that they should keep him for the duration of the contract that's upcoming? I think it's a good conversation to have, Anthony. There's 3 years and $51 million of reason to say probably shouldn't go in that direction if you're the Giants, because he's 31 years old, he's injury prone. Could you take that money and allocate it differently? Now, hear me out, right? This is the reason that I'm going to say that I think that we should probably move on from this contract. The Giants, if they retain him, have to pay $14.45 million in 2024 against the cap for Darren Waller. If they take the out in the contract, they have to pay about $7.8 million in dead money. So they 1 year, take the dead money, and you move on theoretically. The Giants' salary space is already factoring this contract in, so you're saving about $7 million there. You can go out and get pretty decent player with that, or that's basically $2 million less than what we paid for Bobby Okereke, and he's been really good for us. So you can utilize that money certainly to our advantage. Alternatively, you roll that into a bigger contract for somebody else that maybe is a receiver or whatever the Giants need, an offensive lineman. Now, the reason I think they move on is because it's not just the $14.45 million in 2024. It's the $15.5 million in 2025, and it's the $17.5 million in 2026. So that's the reason I'm sitting here like I feel as though the Giants probably will move on, because I don't think, and I think you probably would agree with me here, is it worth it to pay $17.5 million when Darren Waller's 34 years old and he can't stay healthy at 31 years old? Maybe you think that it is worth it, but in my opinion, I think you're setting yourself up for a recipe for disaster here. I think you're setting yourself up for failure. I think that $17.5 million, could go towards a receiver in free agency? Or how about an offensive lineman? Or really anybody that can actually stay healthy, someone that has a proven history of durability. Now, that's not to say that I don't think that it was a worthwhile gamble for the Giants to take on Darren Waller when they traded him for a third-round pick, get a player with that type of upside. But I just don't know if paying him and trusting him to stay healthy is a good method for the Giants, because they went over this. They had a whole sports science thing come in to keep Waller healthy, and he still got freaking hurt. They invested so much in keeping this dude healthy. He's been nagging with injuries this entire season already. Now he's done for 4 weeks. Probably isn't going to be the same again this season. Can we really depend on him to be worth that amount of money? I'm not totally sure. Would love to hear your opinions about it below in the YouTube comment section. But Anthony, what do you think about it? Because I think you definitely have your thoughts.
So I do have my thoughts. I don't think that it's necessarily something that I would make a conclusion on right now. Sitting here looking at these numbers on the contract and also looking at his numbers on the season, I'm not saying that I automatically want to take the potential out in his contract in this upcoming offseason. Really, I think first and foremost, we need to know how long he's truly going to be out, because we know that he's headed to IR and we know that hamstring injuries nag. But is this a hamstring injury that nags and he probably heads to IR for 4 weeks and comes right back? Then I think, it kind of changes the narrative a little bit. Or is this a hamstring injury that nags and he's out like an Andrew Thomas level 7 to 8 weeks? Then that changes the whole entire conversation, because you're probably shutting him down for the season and you're not seeing Darren Waller again until next year, if he's even still on the team. So I do think it really depends on how long he's out with this injury and how quickly he recovers and what his impact is when and if he does return to the field. So I don't think that you can really make any determination or any decision on Darren Waller's future with the Giants right now. It's absolutely a wait and see approach, but I do lean towards keeping him. Now, I understand you could do a lot with that money. You can cut him, save a lot, and do whatever you want in free agency. But really, I think that the Giants need to continue to build through the draft, which is a much cheaper strategy anyway. I don't think that they need to cut players so that they can go in the free agency and spend a lot of money. I don't want the Giants to go in the free agency and spend a lot of money. The talent that they have on their roster, I want them to retain, and I want them to add more talent through the draft. And I don't think that you're going to cut Darren Waller and automatically replace him and find someone of that talent and of that caliber just because you freed up all that money in cap space. Additionally, the Giants are projected to have a boatload of cap space this upcoming offseason. They are not in a desperate need for money unless they go out there and they do try to spend a lot of money. So they can get by with what they have, and they can hold on to Darren Waller if they want to. And in my opinion, because Darren Waller is far and away the best receiving threat on this roster, they should try to hold on to him. Maybe, you kind of take a look at it from a different perspective, right? We went into the season with the idea that Darren Waller's entering this team as the true number one wide receiver. The Giants finally have that, right? From the tight end position, though. But now, what if you take it from this perspective? The Giants can go into this offseason, find that true number one wide receiver, retain Darren Waller, and then he's your number two receiving threat, and then you could have a very dynamic passing attack next season. If you maybe really what it is, and we kind of had this same conversation about Sterling Shepard in the offseason, Alex, maybe it's too much work for him, right? Maybe Darren Waller isn't capable of being the number one receiver. Maybe that's too much, and that's leading to these injuries. But if he's the number two receiving threat, maybe he stays healthy. And that's what we said about Sterling Shepard. He was oftentimes starting when he shouldn't have been starting. He should have been a rotational guy. And if he was a rotational guy, he probably doesn't suffer all of these injuries throughout the past several seasons. Again, maybe it's the same thing with Darren Waller. Having him on the field too much is leading to these injuries. That's just a theory. It's not anything I can confirm. But I will say, I don't think that these numbers on this contract are all that bad. In fact, I think they're arguably a bargain for a player of his caliber when healthy. And I know the health is the question mark here. But for a player like Darren Waller, 3 years, $51 million is what he signed with Las Vegas, $17 million per season. That sounds about right. I think that's on the proper value. You take a look at these numbers prior to this injury. Darren Waller was up there statistically with all of the best tight ends in the NFL. He had a lot of receiving yards. He didn't have any drops. He had a great catch rate. He scored a touchdown a couple weeks ago. Like, he was productive. He was doing his thing. And I think that he was kind of fulfilling that role that the New York Giants wanted him to fill as a tight end who serves as your primary receiving threat. And I think that he could continue to do that. Again, it's just about whether or not he could stay healthy. But I do think that if the Giants got more help around him in this offense, they got another receiving threat, one of those wide receivers that's a true every down receiver and playmaker at all three levels of the field, I think that takes pressure off Darren Waller's shoulders and allows him to just be a really damn good tight end and hopefully stay healthy because of that. So I don't know. I'm not necessarily out on Darren Waller yet. Has this season been disappointing? Yeah, but has Darren Waller necessarily disappointed me? No, because I think he's been one of the bright spots in the worst offense in football. The Giants rank 32nd in every single offensive category, in every single ranking. They're at the bottom. Meanwhile, Darren Waller is near the top for all tight end rankings. That tells me that Darren Waller is not the problem here. He's not even close to being the problem here. In fact, he's one of the solving factors here. He's arguably the solution. If the Giants were more careful and created more plays for Darren Waller and got him more involved in the offense, I think it could have been a better unit for the first half of the season. So I'm not out on Darren Waller. I'm not eager to take this cap space immediately and just cut him in the offseason. I still think that there's talent here. If they do release him, yeah, I understand it. I'm not going to blow a fit. I'm not going to be upset about it because he is an aging player who has a lot of injuries. So if they do decide to cut him this offseason, I would completely understand. But then if they're going to do that and they're going to say that they're doing that because they need to free up cap space, they better use that cap space properly. They better actually invest it into players worthwhile, maybe younger players or players on the offensive line, whatever the case might be. And I think that would be my main argument for releasing Darren Waller. If you were to release him, take all of that cap savings and just go ahead and get a quality starting offensive lineman, actually finally spend big on the offensive line, then I think that's a one-for-one swap you can get behind, right? You're sacrificing a good tight end to get a really good offensive lineman. I think that's valid and that's a fair strategy. But again, just with all of these factors in consideration here, I'm not in a rush to release Darren Waller. I still think that he's a really good and capable tight end when he's healthy. Again, health is the problem here, but I'm not rushing to free up this cap space and see the Giants just spend it on nobodies and do nothing with it all over again. I'm not saying that that's what Joe Schoen's been doing, but look, a lot of these acquisitions that the Giants have made in free agency recently, they're not panning out. The Giants need to start pivoting towards creating talent or finding talent through the draft, building through this youth and building through these draft picks that they keep loading up on every single year. That's the strategy the Giants need to take, and they don't need to free up a bunch of cap space to do that. So holding on to a talented tight end, even though he's not a young up-and-coming player, you still do need some veteran established guys on this roster, and I think that Darren Waller's still one of the best tight ends in the NFL when he's healthy. It doesn't hurt to have him on this roster. It's not a ginormous cap hit, in my opinion. And also, one other argument now that I will make, Alex, and I want to get your take on, because we've talked about this, the Giants could be eyeing a quarterback with a top 5 pick this offseason, right? There's a very realistic possibility that the Giants are bad enough to hold a top 5 pick and they look for a quarterback. Do you really want to bring in another young quarterback that doesn't have a dependable receiving threat and try to develop him? It's been a train wreck every single time the Giants have tried to do that, and we've seen it across the NFL when these young quarterbacks enter the league and they don't have a dependable wide receiver. Teams scramble to get them those dependable wide receivers. The Bears scrambled to go get DJ Moore. We saw that the Panthers were once again trying to trade for a receiver because they didn't have anybody number one to help Bryce Young. Teams are scrambling for these primary receiving threats to pair with young quarterbacks. The Giants have a primary receiving threat on their roster and might be looking for a young quarterback. So if they end up going with that young quarterback, I want Darren Waller here. I want somebody talented in the receiving game for him to throw to. That's a veteran, not just like a Jalen Hyatt's a great player, and I think he's got great potential. But again, he's still growing. He hasn't reached that potential. I think that the Giants would be wise to, if they are planning on looking at quarterbacks, they would be wise to keep a good receiving tight end like Darren Waller in their plans to help that quarterback develop and not be a fish out of water when he gets to the NFL. So I'm curious to know your take on that, kind of that perspective of keeping Darren Waller here because he will help a young quarterback develop if the Giants decide to go that route in the draft.
There's a lot to break down there. So I'll start off with kind of the first take that, he was on pace to be a really good player this year, is on pace with all the numbers in top echelon of the NFL and tight ends. I think that that's a valid claim. My argument against that would be, okay, let's say he has 350 yards right now and a touchdown, and he has like some of the most yards at tight end in the league, and then he misses 5 weeks every single year. Eventually, like, those numbers even back out to being like a mid-tier. You know what I mean? Because he isn't healthy every week. So like you mentioned, he is injury prone objectively. So I think it was a good gamble by the Giants. But here's my counter to, having a young quarterback, or even Daniel Jones for what it's worth, like having a trusted receiving option there, where the Giants could look and say, okay, you know what? We want to take that $17 million and allocate it towards different positions. Let's look at some available options in free agency, right? Darren Waller is objectively a receiving tight end. He's played about 20% of his snaps in line this year, 50% in the slot, and I think around 20-something percent, low 20 percentage points in the outside receiver category. So he's objectively a receiving tight end. He does not really block much. There's options out there. You could go the direction of a guy like Hunter Henry. He has 238 yards and 2 touchdowns this year with New England. He's 28 years old, going to be much cheaper. Dalton Schultz, 220 yards, 3 touchdowns this year, 27 years old, going to be much cheaper. Gerald Everett, 149 yards, 2 touchdowns. Mike Gesicki, 160 yards, a touchdown. Austin Hooper, he's 29 years old. He was one of the best tight ends in football, and, the Browns have just been a disaster at quarterback. So, I think there are alternatives here that are much cheaper and you could argue a much healthier. So that would be my tight end perspective. Let's look at the receivers, because I think that's also a point of perspective that you also mentioned. You want to have a good receiver, somebody that's a veteran. I think about, the team that comes to mind right now is the Titans. Look at Will Levis, I have to say his last name, and DeAndre Hopkins. That Hopkins has been his guy. You don't need a tight end that's going to be injured all the time, when you could go and trade for like a veteran receiver that nobody thinks is good anymore, or just coming off a team like Arizona. How about Mike Evans? Mike Evans stands out as a guy that probably is going to be at the same price, $17 million, maybe a little bit more, but he's also one of the best receivers in football and he stays healthy. How about that option? Or how about, that there's guys like T. Higgins, he's primed to take a big step forward. Another guy I really like, I know, Anthony, I think you like him too, Michael Pittman Jr., really underrated receiver. And, it's just the Colts being the Colts and not really using the receivers properly. Not that the Giants do either, but I think that there are options here for the Giants that, even Calvin Ridley is going to be a free agent. So there are players here that I think are healthy, younger, maybe even cheaper, some of them, that are just objectively more valuable than Darren Waller at this point in time, simply because they stay healthy and he's injury prone. And I'll throw in another thing here. You can draft receiver first tight ends, as you said, build through the draft, build through youth in the mid rounds. You can find a tight end he's not going to be Darren Waller, of course, but you could find like a Dalton Kincaid, or you could find these guys like a Luke Musgrove, maybe some of those type of guys in the mid rounds who are just receiving first type of tight ends who might be able to fill that role. Like we saw Lawrence Cager do a pretty good job when he was on the field. They cut his ass. So he's not Darren Waller again. I'm not comparing those two, but I'm just saying like he plays a very specified role. Now, with that being said, I feel like there are better ways to reallocate that money towards players who are younger and healthier. But, I just don't necessarily I'm just scared of the value, the cost, just the opportunity cost here of taking that money and investing. And it's guaranteed, right? There's no outs in this contract. You could sign Mike Gesicki or Hunter Henry on 1-year deals probably. Like they might not get multi-year deals. Dalton Schultz, really solid player. You might be able to land him on a 2-year deal, a 3-year deal with an out after the second. And that protects you at a cheaper cost and less guaranteed money, comparably to Waller. And you could take that alternative money and roll that into a CB2 alongside Deontay Banks. You know what I mean? There are ways to reallocate this money, in my opinion, or an offensive lineman, I just don't think $17 million for Darren Waller is worth it. Objectively, I just don't think it's worth it because if he's going to miss 5-6 games every single year, every year, you're guaranteeing he's going to be hurt. He was hurt when he went into the season already. The 2 days before the season started, he had a hamstring injury. It was a different part of his hamstring, and now he's injured again. And, again, he basically missed last week against the Jets. He played 17 snaps, and he was out. You know what I mean? He's going to miss essentially 5 weeks straight, and then maybe more. So I just don't know if I'm willing to guarantee all that money to him. There's no way out of it. Andy, that's my concern. If there was an out at some point, there's just no way out of that contract. It's guaranteed until it expires. There's no out after the second season. A lot of it's guaranteed throughout the course of that deal, and you might end up saving a lot of money. And yes, the Giants do have a lot of money, but why can't they spend it more efficiently and just take that dead money now and move on? I'll ask you, kind of run it back. Is there any receivers or tight ends that you think they could allocate the money toward that may be preferable to you? That players that you'd say, I could see that being a better investment long term.
Yeah, sure, there are, but I just think that, listing out all these wide receivers, it's so much easier said than done. You're listing these guys who are impending free agents that you can just go plug in. But I don't know. It's not Madden. Like, you have one of those players on this roster right now with Darren Waller. I understand he's injury prone, but you can't just say, okay, we're going to cut him and just go sign this guy. There's 31 other teams in the NFL. Half of them are going to want to sign that guy too. And also, it's really hard for a guy like a Calvin Ridley, like a Michael Pittman Jr. to shake free. Those guys don't hit the open market. Those opportunities are few and far between. Usually you have to trade for guys like that, which is what the Giants just did with Darren Waller. So finding, just getting rid of Darren Waller and replacing him with a WR1, if it was that easy to get a WR1, the Giants would have had one for the last 7 seasons, but they haven't. So it's not that easy. The Giants had one. They traded him away with Odell Beckham Jr.
They tried with Kenny Galladay.
They tried with Kenny Galladay. It's exactly. That's my point, though. It's so much easier said than done. So what if you go out there and
wasn't a scheme fit, though? You know what I mean?
Yeah, okay, but so what if you go out there and you say, okay, Mike Evans is a consistent, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. He's still old. He could drop off a cliff when you sign him next season. That's totally possible. He's been in Tampa Bay for his entire career. If he just moves over to the New York Giants, you can't expect him to just automatically translate his skill set at his older age. It doesn't always work out, and it's a risk, and the Giants do have a good receiver on their roster right now. I just don't see the point in trying to swap him for another guy who's more expensive, yes, albeit younger and healthier, sure, but there's no guarantee that you're going to get one of those guys. It's so hard to find WR1s in the NFL, so I just don't want to downplay it and say that it's like an easy task and that there's all these receivers and tight ends that the Giants could grab. Like some of those other cheaper options that you mentioned, like a Mike Gesicki, like sure, he's a good, capable, average tight end that you could sign, but you already have a really good tight end, and then you're still not going to have your WR1 that you want if you bring in Mike Gesicki, and it's just so hard to find WR1s. Like the Giants have tried to do this for the last several seasons, and they failed miserably over and over again, and so have plenty of other NFL teams. It's just not that easy to do, so it's easier said than done. I like a lot of those names that you mentioned. If the Giants could get any one of those players, hell yeah, I'm hyped. If they could trade for some wide receiver in the NFL, you mentioned T. Higgins. He's having a really bad year. He's not even on pace for 1,000 receiving yards. You were talking about this 6 months ago. Of course you want T. Higgins. Now you're like, okay, well, maybe he's not as good as we thought he was. So it's always just an ever-changing thing here with all these wide receivers because it's just so insanely difficult to find that WR1. The Bengals thought they had 2 WR1s on their roster, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Jamar Chase was a top 10 draft pick, which it's pretty hard to find wide receivers that are worthy of drafting in the top 10 and that pan out that way. And then T. Higgins, no, wasn't a top 10 draft pick. They thought he was a WR1. He's proven right now that he's not, and he's been a struggling WR2 for the Bengals. So I just think it's way more difficult than people realize to get those WR1s. And right now the Giants have one of those dependable receiving tight ends on their roster. I know he's not always healthy, but at least if you do bring in a young quarterback or just to start the season, if you're able to find one of those primary wide receivers and pair him with Darren Waller, that's excellent. But I don't think that it's a wise idea to just move on from Darren Waller prematurely to try and replace him with some other dominant wide receiver when, again, you don't know if they're going to pan out when you sign them. And also, it's way, way too hard to just go find those guys. If it was easy for the Giants to go find a WR1, we wouldn't even be having this conversation because they would have had one for the last 5 seasons. But it's really freaking difficult to do. I mean, we've been talking about getting Daniel Jones a WR1 for years. They tried with Kenny Galladay, as you mentioned. They had Golden Tate as their WR1 for a little while. It's not that easy. And so because of that, I just think that the New York Giants, they have a good thing on their roster here with Darren Waller. I hate that he's always hurt. I wish that he was always healthy. He's not. But if you can keep him on the roster and if he plays well when he's on the field and you pair that with another developmental, hopeful WR1 upside player, I think that makes the most sense. But just cutting Darren Waller and hoping to replace him with a player of similar talent level who's healthier, I mean, that's just really, really difficult to do, and I'm not going to personally set unreasonable expectations that the Giants can just instantly find a WR1 overnight this offseason because, again, for the last decade almost, it's proven to be a really, really difficult task for the Giants.
Yeah, I'll just say, I don't think we're losing a WR1 in Darren Waller. I don't, look at his stats with Daniel Jones. You know what I mean? They were bad objectively. Tyrod Taylor played well with him. That's the funny thing. I just don't know if Daniel Jones can maximize a player like Darren Waller, if he can maximize as long as the pass protection is spotty. It's a tough situation to be in for the Giants, but I don't think it's impossible. These players want to go to free agency. You know what I mean? Yes, there's other teams that want them, but objectively speaking, if you're a free agent, you want to go to free agency or if you're a player that's headed toward that, because you want to drive the price up. You want there to be a bidding war. You want there to be money spent on you. So Now the question is, like, you obviously incorporate the franchise tag. There's other things here that go into it. And yes, a lot of those receivers could certainly be off the board. But this is a pretty interesting class. You Mike Evans, Odell Beckham Jr., which we're not going to go down that path. Curtis Samuel's an interesting player, but he's not a wide receiver one. There's, like I said, there's T. Higgins, but like you said, he's not having the best year ever. Marquise Brown, Calvin Ridley. The problem is, like you said, you're not going to get a WR1 off the free agent market, but I don't think that Darren Waller's a WR1 to begin with right now. And especially if the injury, like, even on this team, like, he's our top receiving option, but he doesn't produce WR1. He's not producing Jamar Chase numbers. Like, you really have to draft those guys, as you kind of mentioned, and then develop them. But that's still, like, you could still spend that money elsewhere on different players and then try to develop somebody. I think that both opinions can be right, and, we'll see what they do. But I do think that $17 million for an injury-prone receiver or injury-prone tight end, and that's going to be in 2026 when he's 34 years old, is a huge freaking risk. Like, I'm trying to get the Giants to stop taking risks like this, putting money in players that cannot be depended on, and they're old as hell, like 34 years. If you're a Yankee fan, the Yankees do this shit too. Josh Donaldson, $50 million at 37 years old, and he sucked. You know what I mean? Like, if you're a Giants fan, do you really want to be paying a tight end $17 million at 34 years old? He's not Travis Kelce. So, like, that's my concern. Like, it's the risk for me, but the other way, like you said, the other direction, going to free agency, going into those things, is also a risk. It's just a matter of, like, which risk do you want to take? It's kind of playing Russian roulette if you're the Giants.
Well, just another thing that I'll say, you can cut Darren Waller 2025. You can hold on to him for one more season. Maybe this upcoming offseason, you find that developmental WR1 who's ready to take over in 25, and then you cut Darren Waller. My whole point here is that I'm not in a rush to cut Darren Waller. I'm not in a rush to get the cap savings and try to reinvest them elsewhere. If Darren Waller is, not performing well in 2024, you can cut him in 2025, but you don't have to cut him immediately, is basically my take here. And I wasn't saying that he's a WR1. I said we wanted him to be, and he hasn't panned out that way. He's been a better tight end, one of the best tight ends in the NFL, arguably, statistically at least, but I'm not saying he's a WR1. I've been saying this whole time he's a WR2. Imagine if the Giants did have a WR1 like what they had in Las Vegas last year with Devontae Adams, who went and had the best season of any wide receiver in the NFL last year while playing alongside Darren Waller. And Darren Waller was playing really well until he had the hamstring injury and got injured, and of course that's the recurring theme here. But having a WR1 plus Darren Waller, that's the key right there. Like, that's the dream scenario. And that's what we were saying even in the offseason. We wanted Darren Waller to be our WR1 this season, but we would love for them to have a true primary wide receiver and Darren Waller. So I'm not in a rush to cut Darren Waller because maybe you find that true primary number one receiver and you pair him with Darren Waller, and then maybe you cut him next offseason. So my whole take here is I'm just not in a rush to cut Darren Waller. Like I said at the start of the episode, let's wait and see on the injury. Maybe he doesn't even land on IR and he's back in 2 to 3 weeks. Maybe he lands on IR and he misses the whole season, and then, yeah, maybe I am down to cut him. But I'm not in a rush to make any decision just yet, and I think that looking ahead to the offseason, yeah, there's a lot of options out there for the New York Giants. They can reinvest their money elsewhere. They could try and trade for receivers and all that stuff. But again, I think you have a good player on your roster. At some point, the New York Giants have to stop getting rid of good players, and they have to start holding on to some of these good players and adding more good players to play alongside them. I feel like oftentimes the Giants cut good players, get rid of them, and they don't bring in necessary replacements, and the roster just kind of middles out and doesn't really improve year in and year out. I think you can have Darren Waller and have a WR1. Both of those things can coexist with one another, and that's honestly the ideal scenario here. So I don't know. It's an interesting debate for sure. It might be a little premature to have the debate because we don't know the necessarily full details on Darren Waller's injury. Once we get them, of course, we'll update you on them right here on Fireside Giants, and of course give our takes on this situation once again once we have that update. So make sure to leave a like if you did enjoy this episode. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. Ring the bell so you don't miss an episode, and comment your thoughts on the topic down below in the comment section. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and go ahead and follow us on all of our social media channels at Fireside Giants. But without further ado, we will catch you all on the next one. Have a good one, and let's go Giants.